Hello and welcome to the third and final webinar of the 42 Crunch three-part series on the OWASP API Security Top 10. This series has been especially designed to take a deep dive into understanding and addressing the OWASP API Security Top 10 issues, and to provide you with a step-by-step walkthrough of each of the challenges, how to identify problems and how to fix them. Just a little bit about our speakers before we dive into the actual knitting. If you're a newbie to the sessions, you won't have met the guys, but on the left here we have Colin Domoney, who is from 42 Crunch. Colin heads up our API security research initiatives, and he's also a developer advocate here. And in his copious amounts of spare time, looks after the curation and editing of the industry's #1 API security newsletter, apisecurity.io. And if you're not familiar with it, I suggest you get a subscription ASAP. And on the right-hand side, once again, I'd like to thank Dr. Philippe De Ryck of Pragmatic Web Security for joining us on the webinar. He's a founder of Pragmatic Web Security, travels the world to teach practitioners on the ins and outs of building secure software. So no further ado, I'll shut up and hand over to Colin and Philippe. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, thanks very much, Hugh. Welcome to everybody joining, and Philippe, good to have you on this third part. It certainly went quickly. Here we are, the end of March already, and the third and final, unfortunately, final part of this series. It's been great so far. What are we going to be talking about today?
API security, right?
Yeah.
We covered half of the OWASP API security top 10 last session. We talked about authentication authorization back then. Today, we're going to talk about the remaining issues, which is number 4, 7, 8, 9, and 10. And I'm not going to cover them in order. I'm going to mix it up, and we'll see where we end up by the end of this webinar here today. I'm pretty sure for these topics, people will have questions, so please drop them in the Q&A. We like nothing better than hard questions to answer. Hopefully, questions we can actually answer, and otherwise, it's things we should probably figure out how to answer them in the future. All right, before we dive in, Colin, there's something I've been wondering about, and we haven't gotten to that in our prep yet. So if you look at these 5 issues of today, which one is your favorite? Which are you looking forward to the most of these 5?
I think the security misconfiguration, because I think that's, yeah, I think, or assets management is always a good one. You know, the challenge of trying to secure what you don't know and what you do know. Yeah, I think that's something people battle with.
Yeah, absolutely. Security misconfiguration is a nasty one. That's interesting. Mine is 4. I like the lack of resources and rate limiting, because it's kind of this undervalued thing, but we'll get to that in a lot of detail later on. But it seems like people just brush it aside, like, yeah, denial of service, we know about that. But there's definitely a lot more to it, and that's exactly what we're going to dive into. Let's start with Facebook. Why not? There's always something happening at Facebook. In this case, Facebook has a bug bounty program. So that basically means that people are trying to hack Facebook, which is kind of the point, so that they can earn some money by reporting those vulnerabilities. And in this case, the attacker was trying to get access to users' accounts, because those are typically high-value vulnerabilities. If you can do that, they're going to give you the big bucks, basically, if you report that vulnerability. And in this case, they were trying to brute force a 6-digit code on the password reset, the account recovery process. And Facebook had some rate limiting in place, 10, 12 attempts, and they're like, yeah, you're out of here. You can no longer try that. We're not going to allow you to brute force an account. Good, right? I mean, it's in green, so that's awesome. And it turns out that if you're a hacker, you have to be somewhat creative. And the hacker went looking for, like, where else can I try this? And they found that Facebook actually has beta APIs deployed on publicly accessible domains where they can try out new features and maybe shift a couple of users to that API and see what happens. And that API supports the same recovery process, the same 6-digit code. But the interesting part here is that they forgot to implement rate limiting on that beta API, because it's obviously used for all kinds of tests. And in this case, they're like, oh yeah, it's less important. It's just a beta API, but it works with real accounts, real reset codes, and basically brute forcing a 6-digit code without limits will take you a couple of minutes at best. And at that point, you can take over any account you want, basically. And that brings us immediately to the first takeaway, which is that you have to treat your APIs like your children. And I know it's a kind of non-serious way to describe this, but my kids have the age between 1 and 7 basically, which means you have to keep track where you put them. Like if you put them in the yard, you have to check up that they're still in the yard, not strangling each other every now and then, and you kind of want to keep them out of trouble. And the same holds for your APIs. You need to know about your APIs. You need to know where they are. And if you want to make this a bit more serious, which is kind of what I'm here for, what I want to say here is that your attack surface consists of the sum of all the APIs out there, regardless of whether it's an actual production API, a beta API, or some old piece of junk you have lying around from the early 2000s. Doesn't matter. If the attacker can access it, they can exploit it. And that basically brings us to the need for assets management. And I really wish that I could give you like a very detailed guideline of how to do asset management, but honestly, I really can't, because the best advice I can give you is like, do it. That's kind of it. You need to know about what you have API wise. There's a couple of common solutions, maybe a couple of products that can help you with that, but it's in many organizations, it's a very unsolved problem. And that's something that we're going to have to work on in the coming years, especially with the rise of more and more APIs. Things I can tell you is two guidelines. Assign responsibilities for your assets, because tracking them like, okay, we have this many assets, awesome. But what happens if a log4j vulnerability pops up in one of them? You need to know who has the responsibility to follow up on that, fix it, deploy it, make sure it works as intended, and so on and so on. So you need to assign those responsibilities to people in your organization, follow up on that, ensure that they still make sense, that people know what their responsibilities are. And then finally, maximize API reuse. If you can avoid having 5 similar APIs that basically do the same thing for 5 applications, if you can merge that into a single API, a service that you can use across applications, it's going to make your life a lot easier in the end. That's essentially kind of what we're aiming for here. Unfortunately, that's kind of in this session the best I can do. But we have a question for you on how you do your inventory and tracking, just to get an idea of where you are, what you're doing. And of course, you can use the chat to drop details on what's happening here. So Colin, you want to take this one?
Yeah, I mean, this challenge of inventory, I come from an investment banking world, and it's pretty hard to keep track of 5,000 apps. So what are you using to track and manage your API inventory? Worst case, are you doing anything at all? I guess most people, when you're doing spreadsheets or trackers, are you using features in your API management platform and gateways, or are you doing something smarter with building an inventory, checking out what's in your code repos? So get those answers coming in now. We'll just do a quick vote, just give you a moment to vote, and then we'll have a look at what people have said. Okay, so the answer is probably not unsurprising. Yeah, most people are doing it manually. Obviously, one of the good things with APIs is the management and gateway platforms could give you some of these things for free. 1 in 5 people aren't doing anything at all. Also not terribly surprising.
Thank you for the honesty, by the way. I mean, it's not fun to say like, yeah, we don't do anything about tracking this, but having that information is really an eye-opener for a lot of people here. Like, oh, this is really an unsolved problem in many organizations. Absolutely.
Yeah. Philippe, just before you move on, there's a question on the chat. Can pen testing not solve the issues that we're talking about?
Sure, but the premise here is that one of your uninventorized APIs can cause you security issues. And sure, if you do pen testing, you might find a couple of common vulnerabilities, but pen testing is just one process in the whole chain, one link in the chain, one tool in the toolbox. And if you don't know that an API is out there, then chances are you haven't tested it for security either, because somebody just forgot about the fact that this thing is running and is still running. So it could help if you first release a product to make it more secure, to find obvious vulnerabilities, sure. But in the end, if you don't know that it's out there, then it's going to get outdated. It's going to become vulnerable through something as silly as log4j. Well, it's not silly, but a simple or straightforward massive vulnerability. If you don't know where your APIs are that might suffer from it, then bad things will happen in the end. Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I think the other thing I'd add is, pen testing is great, but one thing pen testing doesn't do is scale well, right? So if you've got a huge inventory, it's not going to be economically viable to pen test everything, and you certainly can't do it any kind of highly CI/CD process where you want to automate this. So, it has its points. And then just seeing the question there on the chat, the 42 Crunch platform uses OAS. Do we have recommendations for libraries for different languages? The .NET example, Swashbuckle, is a good intermediary. There are great things. Most of I don't have answers for that. We will do it. I'm in the process of doing a blog post on Micronaut. We've got a blog post on what Spring Boot can do for you. Keep an eye on 42 Crunch, because this is something that a lot of our customers are asking us as well. So good question. I'm not going to answer that in greater detail now, but keep an eye on our blog posts. Right.
Awesome.
Philippe, if you want
Absolutely.
to move on.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I do. Thank you. Let's make you happy. Let's talk about security misconfiguration. So since you're here anyway, let me ask you a question. Which HTTP methods do this Flask API endpoint? Flask is a Python framework, by the way. What is supported here? Get posts. What do you think?
Yeah, Flask, I don't know. I've just done something with Node and Koa, and it kind of by default accepts all endpoints implicitly. You don't, if you don't define anything, you'll have a handler for all endpoints. I would guess that's certainly going to do get. It probably does some others.
Yeah, I like the fact that you're like, I don't know about Flask, but the other ones, oh my God, they do all kinds of things. And that's exactly the problem I'm aiming at. You don't know. Honestly, I once knew, but I forgot whether it actually does more than gets, but I'm pretty sure that it does at least get and post when you don't specify it. And this leads exactly to vulnerabilities like this. This is from last year. OkCupid, if I'm not was this OkCupid? No, I don't remember which application it was either, but doesn't matter. OkCupid had similar issues. In this case, attackers used basically a GET request to an post endpoint and were able to bypass certain restrictions that only applied on post requests. And that's explicitly relevant when you're dealing with things like cross-site request forgery, because their GET requests are often like, this is fine. It's about getting information. But in this case, a GET request resulted in the modification of certain informations through post, which is not how things are supposed to happen. And this very simple thing is a surprisingly common misconfiguration in many API applications. And it's becoming very prevalent and something very easy to fix as well, because most frameworks, and the ones you mentioned have probably that level of support as well, allow you to specify like, hey, this endpoint supports post, done. And then the framework knows like, okay, if it's a post request, I'll handle it. If it's a put, patch, delete, gets, whatever, I don't want that. And it's going to give you a nice error message instead of just handling the request as it would otherwise. And that's a first takeaway for security misconfiguration, restricting HTTP methods. And you can do that in a Flask, in Spring Boot, in so many other frameworks as well. Ensure that you only accept expected HTTP methods, not the other ones. You have to do this with code analysis, like looking at the code, either automatically or manually, doesn't matter. Look like whether you enforce this, but also use dynamic testing to ensure, write a bunch of tests in your test suite that just throw a GET request at a post endpoint and expect a proper error message instead of just a 200 OK. All right, takeaway number one. But since Colin likes this issue so much, which I actually didn't know up front, we have a bunch more of security misconfigurations, something from a couple of weeks ago. By the way, I'm often using PortSwigger, the daily swig, as a source. It's an absolute awesome source on all kinds of security issues, next to APIsecurity.io, of course. This case, web security vulnerability, opens a plethora of attack possibilities, and the details are kind of dirty. And the details are following from weird browser behavior, basically. So what's going on? In this case, we have, again, that API endpoint. We have a post request. But the question now is, which content type is accepted here? Does this endpoint accept JSON data, or does it accept other types of data as well? And by default, there's no restrictions. And it's like, okay, but we're parsing that as JSON. So what's going on here? Let's look at a couple of details to figure out why this might be an issue. On top, you have a sample request, a post request to a /tasks endpoint where we create a task. Title is drink milk. You have to drink milk to get strong bones. At least that's a common perception. Not sure if that's true, but let's assume it is. If you want to send that request from a browser, so let's say that I want to trick Colin. Colin is the victim here. I want to trick his browser to send a request in his name. I can send that request from a web page that I control. I can tell Colin, like, look at this awesome article. He's going to open it up, and my page runs in his browser, sends a request to the backend of the task manager at example.com, and basically creates a task. And when my page instructs his browser to do that, the browser is going to be like, hold on, that's a JSON request. On line 3, you see this is JSON data. I only do that when the server says it's okay to do that. And that's CORS, cross-origin resource sharing. So the browser will check with the server, are you sure you want this request coming from, I don't know, pragmaticwebsecurity.com? And the server on api.example.com is going to be like, no, I don't. And it's going to ignore that. And the browser will not send a request. And the whole thing is probably is handled as it should be. No fraudulent request coming from Colin's browser to that API. That's good. But what if the API of this task manager doesn't enforce that? What if the API is like, yeah, whatever. If it looks like JSON and it parses like JSON, then it's going to be JSON, and I'm fine with that. I don't care about the content type. Could be a very liberal way of implementing that API, but maybe not the best approach, because setting that content type to text/plain allows an attacker like pragmaticwebsecurity.com running in Colin's browser to send that request without those CORS restrictions, because browsers have a way of sending text/plain requests without any enforced restrictions, because that has been in browsers for a very long time. And that would mean that I can smuggle the request out of Colin's browser to the API. The API may mistakenly process it as a legitimate JSON request, which is now resulting in an attack that happened against those Grafana systems as well. And this is dirty. This was not a vulnerability in Grafana, by the way. They checked for JSON requests, but they did impartial string matching. So what they did is they checked if the content type header contained application/JSON, but they didn't care about anything else, which means you could send like text/plain semicolon application/JSON, which makes no sense at all, but doesn't trigger CORS restrictions and basically allows the attack to be smuggled out anyway. As you can see, a couple of crazy scenarios that you don't really need to break your head over, because the defense, we're builders, we're defenders, the defense is really easy. Reject anything that is not application/JSON. It's that simple. How do you implement that? Well, now I kind of regret I used the Python example, because Python or Flask doesn't have built-in support for that like other frameworks do, but you can easily build a decorator, which you can apply to an endpoint, as you can see here on line 2. So we define a content type decorator. The actual interesting code is on line 7. We get the header value, we match it against the expected content type or the allowed content type, which we provide in line 15. That's how we apply the decorator. We basically say this endpoint expects application/JSON as a content type. Anything else will result in an unsupported media type error, which is the proper way of handling this. Frameworks like Spring Boot have built-in support for that. You have the consumes annotation for what you expect as input, and then the produces annotation for what you provide as output. All right, takeaway number 2 about number 7, security misconfiguration: restrict your HTTP content types. Ensure your API only accepts expected content types, even when the unexpected value looks somewhat correct. Like, we don't care about you almost got it right. It's either right or it's rejected. That's essentially what this comes down to. All right. In a browser-based world, there's a lot of sorry, I have to watch my language here. There's a lot of things that can go wrong. Let's put it like that. There's a lot of things that can go wrong. Here's a JSON response from an API. Looks a bit funky, right? The title is still correct, but the description contains HTML code. JavaScript HTML, basically. This will execute JavaScript code, will it? Well, no, it doesn't. It's JSON data. I mean, this means nothing to JSON. It's just a weird looking string, but JSON doesn't really care about that. But what happens if this gets rendered in the browser? What happens if I can give Colin a link and he opens it in his browser and it takes him to this API endpoint /task/1, which will result in this page being returned to the browser? Will the browser execute that? Yes or no? Maybe. Depends on the configuration of the server, of course. If the server tells the browser, like, this is JSON data, then the browser will not execute it. But many APIs just return some value as output, and some Flask configurations have that as well. And when they do, there's going to be a text/HTML content type on that response, which is not good. And that when you have that, then you basically have a nasty vulnerability where somebody can trigger a browser to navigate to an API endpoint, get some data, text-based data, parse it as HTML, and start executing that malicious JavaScript in that response. The consequences are pretty severe. We're not going to dive into cross-site scripting here. We're not a front-end security webinar. We're an API security webinar, but the consequences are pretty severe, and that's something that you typically don't want to happen. How can we fix that? Well, there's two things you should do. You should set a proper content type on your response. Again, if you're serving JSON, set a content type to application/JSON, which is very much enforced or reinforced by the OpenAPI definition you have for your API, because you specify the content type of your response as well. Second, we add an X content type options no sniff header to tell the browser, like, trust what I'm sending you. Don't try to be smarter than my response header and see if you can probably figure out what other content type this is. Just trust me on this one. It's going to be JSON data. And that's the best practice for serving API responses. And I can keep going about crazy browser behavior, like literally covered one quirky case after the other, but the attacks are very difficult and to explain and hard to grasp. Instead, I want to talk about defenses. I want to talk about medieval defenses, like defense in depth and this beautiful castle somewhere in the world. I haven't prepared my images very well, but this beautiful castle somewhere in the world actually applies defense in depth quite well, right? If you want to attack this, you have to cross the moat first. Maybe there are alligators in there, I don't know. But you have to get across it. Then if you scale the wall, but there's going to be people on top that are going to drop hot stuff on you and try to scare you away. And that's called defense in depth. And we can apply something like this to our APIs as well, where we basically tell the browser, in case you run into this very weird scenario where somebody manages to render an API response, apply these restrictions on that. And here's an overview of 4 security headers that I want you to configure on every API that you're running, because these 4 headers will basically tell the browser to behave in the strictest way possible, even when trying to render something. Let me walk you through them. Number 1, strict transport security basically tells the browser you only want to speak over HTTPS. So whenever somebody tries to force an HTTP request for God knows what reason, the browser is going to be like, yeah, no, I'm not going to do that. I'll use HTTPS instead. That should be a default on every web application you build. Number 2, we covered that. X content type options no sniff tells the browser, like, trust my content types, don't touch them, just use them. Number 3 prevents framing. That's a weird attack vector where somebody can try to render an API response, the JSON data, in a frame and do all kinds of social engineering attack with that data. With this configuration, line number 3, the browser will be trying to load that response, looks at the frame like, oh, I'm loading this in a frame, but the API says, no, okay, I'm not doing it. Problem goes away. Trust me, there are some weird things that can happen if you don't set this header. And then number 4 is a content security policy, the strictest one you will find, by the way. And that one applies in case the browser mistakenly tries to render a response as HTML. That sandbox keyword you see there in the middle tells the browser, like, yeah, this is untrusted content at that point. You should not execute any JavaScript code, just turn it off and don't do a lot of other things either. And that's a very strong configuration. And it's not a core thing. It's a defense in depth mechanism. It's not a core security mechanism, but setting this as a static configuration will take out all of these weird browser-based side effects from some quirky attack scenarios. So that brings us to that takeaway. Use that defense in depth strategy, especially when your API is being reached by browsers. Apply these security headers because they're going to take away all of these quirky effects from browser-based behavior. And the trade-off here between cost and benefit is through the roof, because the cost is very little. I mean, it's literally going to this slide, copy-pasting the text into your Nginx config, maybe update the syntax a little bit so it doesn't throw errors, and you're done. Just set this as a response in your reverse proxy, and you're good to go with that security header configuration. All right, hope you like that. Now that Colin got his, let's talk about my topic. Number 4, lack of resources and rate limiting. This topic is, to me, it's actually pretty awesome, because when we talk about that, when we talk about that with APIs, the obvious case is denial of service. Everybody talks about denial of service. Like, what if somebody takes down your API? Like, that's annoying, sure. Maybe they rack up some AWS costs, which is also very annoying. But to me, there's a whole bunch of scenarios where other things can go wrong, which fall under the same topic. And I think these are much more interesting, to be honest, because denial of service is, well, let's face it, it's denial of service. It's not that interesting security-wise. What happens if somebody abuses application features? We saw that in the opening story that we started with, the Facebook brute forcing of recovery codes. That's a much more interesting case of lack of rate limiting, in my opinion, because the attacker is actually abusing application features. And they do that for all kinds of things. If you make some calculations, they can abuse your application to do calculations for them. They can abuse a credit card endpoint to check card numbers, and so on and so on. These are very common features that might be hammered by requests, and they shouldn't be. That's number 4, a lack of resources and rate limiting. What about the scenario where we exceed usage restrictions? Like if you're on the free plan and you can only make 10 API calls per hour, well, not enforcing that can give people not much reasons to sign up for the non-free plan. So you might want to enforce these usage restrictions in practice, and you need rate limiting and certain controls for that. And what about large-scale exploitation? What about somebody abusing a BOLA vulnerability, as we talked about in the previous session? Like, oh, all of a sudden I can access documents from any user in the system. That's not very good. But what if I can abuse that vulnerability and extract like 1 million documents per hour, collecting gigabytes of information and then dropping them online? That's going to be even lesser good. That's a lot worse. And maybe some rate limiting mechanism that you have in place can prevent the mass scale exploitation of such a vulnerability. It's not going to save you in the end, but it will at least reduce the impact somewhat. That brings us to the first takeaway of this topic. It's more than denial of service. It's a lot more. Even though well, I've read the literature. I'm an expert in the field. I know what everybody's talking about, and most of the time you'll find people talking about denial of service, not about anything else. All right. Awesome. That's the bad stuff. Let's talk about how we can actually prevent things. Let's go back to this image, and I'm going to talk about a couple of defensive strategies. I want to walk you through 4 concrete strategies, and I'll recap them again in one of the takeaways after we have done so. Let's talk about the first one. The first one first, kind of obvious, but let's talk about the first attack scenario, denial of service. Denial of service is often about exhausting resources, about filling up the pipe of the network connection, things like that. Depends a bit on the application itself. This solution is typically either infrastructure limitations or computation limitations. You'll find plenty of guidelines about setting up Docker containers with limited CPU, limited memory, limited file access, which basically helps you constrain that in case somebody manages to abuse one of these containers. At least there's a cap on what they can do. And depends on what machine you're running that on. But if you have a very beefy server, then it's not even going to blink about one Docker container doing something weird within its own limits. And for infrastructure, if you want to do network level denial of service protections, you probably need a lot of infrastructure to make that happen, or rely on one of the providers like Cloudflare and so on, who can handle that for you. All right, that one is done. Good. What are some more interesting strategies here? What else can we do to basically avoid these abuse scenarios? Well, one other interesting thing is application level input validation. I mean, that's as simple as it gets, right? Here's a use case where this actually matters and is sometimes not enforced, causing massive amounts of problems. Pagination, present in a lot of applications, a lot of APIs. So if you want to get a list of tasks, you can get page 1, count 10, meaning you get 10 results from the start of the list of tasks. What if somebody asks for this? Well, first of all, I feel very sorry for you, because if you have 1 million tasks, then your life must not be very good, I would say, to getting things done. But somebody can just give you a count value of 1 million, and then the system will have to collect a million of these tasks, which can be very cheap, but sometimes it's a very expensive operation, collecting all of that information, compiling it, sending a large response back to the client, and that can take out a server. That's a variation of denial of service with a single request. One request, so not something that you can easily stop with infrastructure level detection mechanisms, but something you can stop with input validation. What if we just limit that count value to 100? That would kind of solve our problem. Yet some of these seemingly unimportant values are often not checked. They're often handled in libraries with automatic pagination features, which may not enforce limits and can effectively cause those issues for you. One of the friends that can help you here, and we've talked about that before in this session and the previous sessions, is an open API definition. Because there's actually a feature, a way to describe integers like this count value with a minimum value and a maximum value. And it gives you a very clear example, like, okay, this value can be between 10 and 100. You know how to read this. It's YAML. Everybody can read that. And now you have a concrete guideline, but also something that you can actually enforce. You can use this to enforce this in your API gateway, or you can use this to manually write tests or test your API. Does it correspond to the specification? Yes or no? And it gives you a lot of information. Very simple, very straightforward way of solving some problems with rate limiting. Application level input validation. What else can we do? Well, what if we make it someone else's problem? That's one of my favorite solutions, basically. Like authentication, like, yeah, no, let's not handle passwords and account recovery and 6-digit, it's like, whatever, man. Let's use an OpenID Connect provider. Let's push authentication to a third-party service. Let's throw some money at them and let them handle that for us. And we don't have to worry about that anymore. That's offloading. That's actually really useful. You can also offload within your own infrastructure, within your own application, basically. Common example, image processing. Like you upload an image, it has to get resized. That's one of the topics where I would advise you to stay away from that, because image processing is absolutely horrible to build in a secure way. But if you're ever in the need of building that, build that as a separate service. Pull it out of the application, isolate it from the main application, put it in its own network, fully firewalled, and if something goes wrong, let it go down without affecting the rest of the application or exposing any of the other data. That's essentially one of the ways to get that done. And of course, makes it easier to apply things like network level isolation and so on and so on. All right. The fourth one is application specific rate limiting. And before we dive into an example there, Colin wants to ask you another question about what you're doing in your organization. So it's time for poll question number 2.
Well, this question is around GraphQL. We talked about GraphQL a bit. There's a question online about this as well. Who's using GraphQL? Are you using it internally? Are you using it both internally and externally? Feeling brave? Not yet, but you've got some plans, or no, you don't have any plans. So pop through your answers to that quickly. Just really curious on my part, because we get asked about GraphQL quite a bit, and just interested to get a pulse check on where people are with us now.
Should we have added an option like WTF is GraphQL? Wow.
Okay, so the answer's okay. Interesting. So over half people don't plan on doing that, on using GraphQL. That doesn't surprise me in particular. Only
it does
9%.
surprise me a bit. I didn't realize it was over half of people that are like, yeah, we don't care. No GraphQL, thank you.
Yeah. Cool.
All
so
right.
Thanks for the answers. Philippe, I'm just going to interrupt you quickly. We got a really good question from Patricia on the Q&A. Third-party partner APIs, where you don't have any access to their code or environments, or how they've implemented the APIs. What can you as a consumer do to kind of validate the integrity and the behavior of that API?
Wow. It depends on what you're allowed to do. Let me say that first. So
okay.
Ideally, you can throw crap at it and see how it responds, but your partner may not be very fond of that. second part of my answer is depends on how big you are. For example, Google has this requirement for people interacting with Gmail, which is kind of their flagship product, which is very sensitive, of course, and they force their partners to undergo a third-party security review. So they're basically like, you're going to get a security review and you're going to share the results with us, otherwise no access for you, which is, of course, something you can do if you're Google. And otherwise, it's, yeah, I mean, it's going to be a collaboration between you and the partner. If you're worried about that, then I would suggest talking to them and convincing them, or putting it in the contract that you really want to have a security review of their applications, either in a collaborative effort or they have to do it themselves. But there's going to be have to be some trust between parties, and you both have to be willing to work on that. But my advice would be work on that together to make sure that things are up to your standards if you have the ability to do that.
I think a lot of these things, it depends on the kind of the balance of power and the relationship between the two parties. You know, what I've seen before, you can enforce it through legal and procurement. But of course, if we're talking APIs and we've got a specification, which of course we do, then the way to do it is with conformance scanning, right? You can just run a conformance scan as part of an acceptance criteria before you'll accept the API. So I hope that answers the question. Yeah, it has. So thanks, Patricia. Good question. Philippe, I'll let you move on in the interest of time.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you about that. So half of you don't care about GraphQL, which kind of makes the next slide painful, because I have a GraphQL example of application-specific rate limiting, just because it's kind of interesting, because it's the nature of GraphQL, basically. Like you accept a query as input from the user. It's like basically comparable to accepting SQL from a client and then just running it against the database. Welcome to GraphQL, I would say. So a denial of service can easily look like this: a circular relationship that overloads the server, one request again to fetch a task and its dependencies, and then a task, and so on, and things start to go bad. The attack doesn't matter much. The defenses are interesting because you'll have all kinds of libraries to limit what can happen. A very simple mechanism is limiting the depth of a query. You have a package, for example, GraphQL depth limit, which allows you to say like, okay, 10 levels deep. That's as far as I want to go. Maybe 5 levels is enough for your application, depends a bit. That's a very coarse-grained mechanism to enforce some application level rate limiting. A second mechanism is much more complicated, used by the GitHubs of the world, for example, where they basically calculate the complexity of what you're trying to do with GraphQL, and they map that amount of that cost against your allocated credits for that period of time. So with GitHub, there's a whole documentation page that says like, okay, the cost is calculated roughly in this way, and you're allowed these and these and these limits. And with those libraries, they can actually calculate the cost of your query and enforce that in practice. In a more traditional example, which I don't have a slide for because this is much more commonly known, you'll have counting requests for per minute or per second or something like that. That's also application level rate limiting, which is typically quite well supported in application libraries and gateways and so on and so on. Brings us to a takeaway for number 4, lack of resources and rate limiting. Well, the takeaway is maybe not very useful. On the left part of the slide, combine various defensive strategies. It's basically not a single solution, but it's a combination of all of these things. It's basically a combination of having some infrastructure level security, isolating services, compartmentalization, maybe put a provider in between that can handle peaks of network traffic that should not affect your systems. Follow secure coding guidelines, use OpenAPI specifications to identify expected behavior, enforce those restrictions. Have some rate limiting mechanisms like application level rate limiting in place, and compartmentalize your application. And take a part of it. If you don't want to deal with complicated stuff like authentication, where you need to handle credential stuffing and brute force attacks and recovery and all of that, consider offloading that to a third party. That might make your life a lot easier, and it might be worth the effort to do that. All right, good. We've been flying through these. I think we have 2 left. That's the problem of doing them out of order. It's easy to lose count, but the next one is injection. Number 8 in the OWASP API Security Top 10. And injection covers everything going from SQL injection or NoSQL injection or command injection or what else of crazy things you can think of. Injection is very well known. We've known about all kinds of injection attacks like SQL injection popping up in JOT token handling. Boom. We've known about SQL injection for 25 years, basically, some roughly like that. And we've known how to fix it for 24.5 years. And we still have SQL injection today. That's reality. I mean, I can talk about injection for an hour if you want to, but everything is out there. I mean, look for injection. You'll find dozens of documents that tell you how to avoid SQL injection, to avoid NoSQL injection, hibernate query language injection, or remote code execution through command injection. My takeaway here is injection still exists. It's not going away. How much we want it to go away, how capable we are of making it go away, it isn't. And you have to take the responsibility of writing secure code. The only way to solve this, there's no magic product that's going to fix this. There's no 42 crunch gateway you can put in between to solve injection. Unfortunately, maybe there is in the future, but for now there isn't, as far as I'm aware. You have to be careful here. But there's no product nowhere that will solve this for you except you writing secure code. And static code analysis that's a tool that you can easily use to find these problems. That's one of the strengths of static code analysis, is finding problems like this where some input ends up in unexpected execution of code later in a dangerous sync. And that segue brings us to polling question number 3, where Colin is going to ask you about injection attacks.
Yeah, so I'm just curious on this question, because we get asked this question a lot. Why is API security different from application security? So hopefully for this category for injection attacks, this is one of the places, one of the rare places where your SAS and DAS tools will do a pretty good job of finding vulnerabilities. So what are you using? SAS, DAS, pen testing, or code reviews and inspections? I would have thought everybody would be doing SAS, but there you go. Okay, thanks very much. Back to you.
All right, awesome. By the way, if you want a pro tip for SAS tools, if you want to get your hands dirty without investing a lot of money, there's this very simple tool, SemGrep, very easy, very straightforward, which is not the smartest, but very good to find some dangerous patterns. So you might want to dip your toes in the water by running that tool against your code base just to see what it can do and whether it is useful for you or not. All right, that leaves us with one topic, and that's logging and monitoring. And that's another one of these topics that's super vague. It's like, yeah, do some logging and monitoring, which is very useful advice, of course, but I want to shed a bit of light on why it's important, what it can do, and what you should do in practice. And of course, from a perspective of security, because that's kind of the point of this webinar. So logging, different levels of logging serve different purposes. That's kind of a dead giveaway. It's often used for debugging, informative purposes, but to me, one of the most important things of logging is audit trails. Like if something goes wrong, let's say somebody posts a screenshot of a user having access to like things they shouldn't have access to. Can you use your logs to figure out what that user did during a specific session? Have you ever tried that? That's a question I often ask customers of mine, like, have you ever tried that? Did you ever take a log and like, okay, let's figure out what this user did just to see if we can do it? And often it's like, yeah, we have no idea which request came from where and what happened and which call to the database eventually came from this request. Like, no, we can't. Okay, then you have some work to do, because this type of logging has to be useful for security-based events. And the second interesting part is logging security-relevant events as critical log messages. There's so many opportunities in an application to log things that basically should never happen, but you're going to catch them anyway, because if you write code the right way, we're not going to be like, yeah, that never happens. Let's not worry about it at all. No, you're going to be like, okay, this never happens, but we handle that exception anyway. First of all, because if you're doing Java, because you have to, otherwise the system complains too much. And otherwise, because, well, you never know when things actually do happen. And I have an example scenario of that where this plays a major role. And this example scenario is about two services that have to send, well, one service on the left has to send data to a service on the right, and it crosses a security boundary. And there's a proxy in a way, a reverse proxy, an Nginx, very common setup, can be a gateway, can be just a load balancer, doesn't really matter much what it does. And what we have here, there's a couple of details. I'm not going to explain everything, but what we have is we have signed JSON Web Token data. So a signed JSON Web Token and an API key to enforce security. Why two? Because the API key is easy to check on a gateway like Nginx. It's very simple to just check, like, does this request have a valid key? Yes, it can go through, otherwise go away. Easy first security boundary. What's really interesting in this image is the kind of things that shouldn't happen. Like, for example, if your Nginx properly enforces an API key in step 3, then step 5 should never fail. Because if step 5 fails, there's a massive problem with your API gateway. That's a security critical log event. If you're going to write code in the service that checks the API key anyway, because that's how you build secure services. But if 5 ever fails, that should raise alarm bells, send off fireworks, and basically wake somebody up in the middle of the night to go look at that, because that is not supposed to happen, like, ever. Now you can start investigating, like, what the hell is going on and why did we get an invalid API key, even though it passed the proxy in the first place. And the same story for 6. If the step 5 succeeds, so the API key is valid, but the signature on that JSON Web Token is invalid, that's a bad problem again, because that means that somebody was able to send a request with a valid API key, but messed with the data. So why did somebody mess with the data? Is your Nginx like flipping bits at random? Maybe that's something you might want to look into, but much more likely is somebody figured out what the API key is, grabbed it from somewhere, stole it, brute forced it, whatever, and is now messing with that service, trying to send the data to see what can go wrong. Both of these are massive problems that should be logged as critical and followed up on, which brings us nicely into monitoring. Monitoring turns a simple data gathering, like collecting as much data as you can, well, not as much because we have privacy rules, but collecting data turns that into a detective security measure. So the first thing is obvious: analyze your logs and act on critical security relevant events. Just having them like critical, the API key was invalid at the service, doesn't do you much good if nobody follows up on that. Second thing you can do is anomaly detection. Look for things that aren't supposed to happen. You can do that post factum as well. So if you have your logs, you can analyze, like, okay, why is there a peak of requests in that specific time period from the same client? Like, that's not normal. And you can maybe look into that. You can do it more active as well. And some systems even have live anomaly detection where they revoke tokens on the fly when they detect something that's invalid. That's something you can do with monitoring as well. And finally, set up procedures to follow when abuse scenarios are detected. It's so common for somebody to finally figure out, like, oh crap, something is wrong. And then everybody's like, what do we do now? That's not the moment you want to start figuring that out. You don't want to figure out when your office is on fire, like, oh yeah, where are the stairs in this building? No, that's something you do up front. And that's why we do fire drills. That's essentially what this is all about. So the takeaway, no, that's wrong. The takeaway here is log and monitor, not do a fire drill. Log and monitor, because logging should be useful. Create high security alerts of failures that should never occur in normal scenarios, and make sure someone follows up on those logs. And that brings me to the final takeaway. Well, a story and then a takeaway, basically. That story is about Equifax. Equifax is this US company that lost like a lot of personal data about a lot of people back in 2017. And I really love this story because, well, first of all, there's a lot of security worst practices to unpack. So that's one thing. But the second thing I really like about this case is because it's very well documented. There was a investigation into Equifax practices by some US committee, and they published a full report about what went on over there. So I'm gonna loop in Colin here before I dive into the story. So what can you tell us about Equifax and the hack in 2017? What happened there?
They were using a vulnerable version of Struts 2. Not the first time that Struts 2 has been fingered in these type of problems. I can't remember the details of the actual exploit, but it was an outdated version, and then they didn't know that they were using this. They didn't know they had this problem. They didn't know they were under attack, basically. Yeah,
it's an absolutely nasty story. So what basically happened is Apache Struts. Well, let me start at the beginning. Let me go back in 2015. That's 2 years before the exploitation of that vulnerability, even 2 years before the discovery. In 2015, Equifax had monitoring devices in their network. They basically monitored network traffic. They made sure that what the data was being sent out wasn't sensitive, that there was detection of anomalies, and so on and so on. And that thing uses a certificate, and that certificate expired. That's kind of the setup. That's the intro to the movie, if you want to call it that. And then in 2017, March 7, there was a big press release. And that said, like, holy crap, we found a massive vulnerability in Struts 2, remote code execution. That's basically as bad as it gets. Here's the patch, update your systems. That was a press release. And the attackers were like, oh, you patched something, huh? And they took the patch and they were like, what did you fix? Interesting. And they, well, within hours, they basically had found the problem and they had a exploit for that. And 3 days later, March 10, they were probing Equifax systems, like almost immediately. Equifax kind of knew about the problem, but they weren't really fast in updating. That's a different story, though. And in May, the attackers started full-scale data exfiltration. They were pumping out data as fast as they could, basically stealing lots of personal information. That was a massive data dump or data extraction operation. This is where things get interesting. In July 29th, somebody at Equifax was like, oh yeah, this network monitoring device is still lying around here. We probably paid a lot of money for that. So why don't we fix that certificate? And they update that expired certificate on the monitoring device. July 29. Keep that date in mind. Also on July 29, that monitoring device starts blaring like, holy crap, something is wrong. Data is leaving the system. And they discover the breach like immediately. They fix the certificate and immediately the thing is like, uh-oh, this is not good. Bam. And it will tell you something is going on. You need to look into what's going on here, and so on and so on. They discovered the breach. They sold some stocks. They announced the breach. They went to prison for selling stocks before announcing the breach. That it's a dirty story. You should look it up. Somebody should actually make a movie of that. It should be pretty intense to watch that. But the takeaway here is run fire drills. Like if you have a network monitoring device like Equifax, or if you have a firewall that looks at network traffic to stop certain things, why don't you feed some data into that? Try to smuggle something out of the network legitimately and see what happens. If it doesn't come up and say like something is wrong, then your defenses aren't working. That's like you have to test your smoke detectors in your house every now and then because who knows if they work? I don't know. So why don't you burn a newspaper underneath and see if they actually start making noise? Otherwise, they're no good. And the same thing for your defenses. You have to try them out. You can't rely on the fact that they work. You have to make sure that they work. All right, let me wrap it up here. Key takeaways for API security. Let me wrap up 3 webinars into 3 very generic but very useful points. Specify expected behavior with open API definitions. That's the core of everything, because everything relies on that, knowing what your API is supposed to do. Tools feed off of that. It's a useful communication tool. Do it. There's no excuse not to do it. Just do it. Verify expected behavior on running APIs in their natural habitat. I mean, it's good to do code analysis, awesome, but also make sure that your API actually behaves like you think it does. Maybe your framework does something else. Maybe the system you run it on allows more than you have accounted for. Test running APIs, dynamic testing, very important. And then finally, readability and auditability enable security. If your code is readable, if your endpoints are clearly saying what is supposed to happen, if you can easily audit that, it's going to be much easier to enable a secure system than if you have to figure out, like, is this handled implicitly? Yes, maybe, I don't know, and so on and so on. And that's part of what we talked about in this session here today. And with that, I have nothing more to say. Thank you very much for listening here.
Thanks very much, Philippe. Just a couple of things. So pop through ideas I've asked in the chat. What else you'd like to hear about? You know, these webinars, we get great attendance on this. And it's a real pleasure for us to be able to share our knowledge and our learning with an audience that is so engaged as this. Let us know what else you want and see them coming through thick and fast. Keep those coming. Philippe, would you just bump the slide, please, for me?
Yes, of course.
Finding out more, so API security, it's the newsletter that I curate every week. It comes out on a Thursday morning. Subscribe to that. That QR code should work. Corey Ball's Hacking APIs, particularly if you're not a adversary, if you don't come from a pen testing background, have a read through that and understand quite how easily a skilled attacker can do some quite bad things to your APIs. It's quite a sobering read. And then that GitHub repo is kind of a one-stop shop of everything in API security. It literally everything is on there. So get connected. Bookmark that. If you could pop the slide forward to upcoming events. So talking about the logging and monitoring, we've got a webinar coming up next month where I'll be working with doing a demo of how the 42 Crunch firewall product can do active monitoring into Azure Sentinel. We're going to do some fun things like showing, live tracking and trying to find out these what an adversary is doing. We're gonna run some attacks against an API and show how in a SOC you can catch these issues. And then we've got a couple of live events, API Secure and the API conference happening in the first week of April. I'll be presenting a couple of times. We've also got Isabel, our founder, who will be presenting alongside Cisco at that event. I don't think I have any more questions. Just just running off that question around the testing, and I saw there were a couple of good answers on that. One of the advantages we have with an API is you have a contract, right? Use that contract as an enforcement point, right? So validate your vendor agreements. Your open API specification is there to help you. So with that, if there's nothing further, thank everybody for their time and look forward to seeing you on our next event. And thank you very much, Philippe.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me. Thank you for the great feedback about the session in the chat as well. That's awesome to hear. The recordings are available, so tell all your friends about it. Like, yeah, this webinar series is awesome. You should go there and watch them all and take advantage of that and go build secure APIs.
Thank you.